Hello, and welcome to Soarin'.
Snow White is a goal we've been aiming at for 10 years. There won't be any Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck to attract the people. They'll all be brand new characters.
It's a world of laughter, a world of tears. It's a world of hopes and a world of fears. There's so much that we share that it's time we're aware. It's a small world. After all,
you see your true colors shining through.
Did you know Disney World is the most popular vacation place on Earth? And you know what? You're coming at just the right time, because Disney has exciting new attractions this summer, like a new land in the Magic Kingdom called Mickey's Toontown Fair.
The porcupine represents faith and trust. He reminds us that we can accomplish great things as long as we truly believe we can.
WDW Radio, your information station.
Hello and welcome to the WDW Radio Show, your Walt Disney World information station. I am your host, Lou Mongello, and this is show number 190 for the week of October 3rd, 2010. Disney historian, author, and former cast member Jim Korkis has just released his first book, The Vault of Walt, and he joins me this week to discuss his history with Disney, as well as how the book came to be, and some of the stories about Walt Disney, the films, parks, attractions, and so much more. I'll have some announcements, then play more of your voicemails at the end of the show, so sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's episode of the WDW Radio Show. I have to say that one of the greatest things I've discovered, and really a true blessing since I've been doing the books and the show and everything else, has been getting to meet and know and befriend Jim Korkis. I had the pleasure of meeting him many, many years ago in person, and I was immediately drawn to his vast knowledge of Disney and his incredible personal stories and that shared passion that we had for all things Disney. And I consider myself fortunate to be able not to have just gotten to know him, but to have him on the show where he shares his incredible stories behind the stories that literally no one else can tell. And finally, Jim has responded to his millions of fans' requests to put out more of those stories and facts and true untold treasures in a book. And his first ever book under his name called The Vault of Walt. And I am pleased to have Jim back to tell some of his story and let us in on how the book came to be, the stories that are inside it. So again, I want to welcome back to the show my friend, Disney historian, speaker, magician, so much more, Jim, I'll always be Merlin Korkis.
Lou, always a pleasure. Although you didn't quite tell your audience the entire truth. The entire truth, of course, is that I pulled a thorn from Lou's paw. And so in appreciation, he's returning that favor by allowing me to plug a brand new book that I've written, which is available now, called The Vault of Walt. Starting on October 3rd, it'll be available at Amazon.com for $19.95, and it's filled with all sorts of wonderful Disney stories. It's over 450 pages long with close to 40 separate stories. And so Lou said, Jim, I want to talk about the book, and I want to talk about its creation, but I also want to talk about the creation of Jim Korkis. So today, I guess that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk a little bit about the creation of Jim Korkis, and you can fast forward through that on your on at home, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the book, and hopefully you'll be encouraged to go out and buy a copy for yourself and buy a copy for a friend as a Christmas gift. So where do you want to start, Lou?
Well, I want to start off by saying that the pleasure is certainly ours by you coming on and sharing this. And I also want you to note, Jim, that for the first time in really a long time, I'm letting you do this over the phone inside instead of in the blazing sun of Florida.
And Lou, I appreciate that because those of the listeners who are in Florida know that we've been going through that heat wave where even if it's 93 degrees, with the heat index and the humidity, it can feel to 110. And so, yes, this is an unusual experience to be talking to you and not sweating and having my clothes stick to my body and hear all of those wonderful background sounds, which I assume you'll incorporate later, so there'll be Disney music behind whatever it is we're saying.
I'm actually just going to come to your house and record some background ambient audio of you shuffling through papers and clacking on the keyboard, because that's really where, because really, this is sort of where the story begins, is in how much of a researcher and a storyteller you are. But look, like I said, you're always telling us the stories behind the stories. And before we talked about the book, I think people want to hear about your story, because I think your journey is so interesting with many, many twists and turns. So tell us a little bit about the early background and your interest in Disney that I had to believe started at a very young age.
Well, I was born as a small mouse in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And since I was wearing pants and gloves and shoes, they kicked me out. No, I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and my dad was a supervisor for American Airlines. And he got transferred to Los Angeles when I was about 4 years old. So moved out to California, to Glendale, California, which is right next to Burbank, where the Disney studios are. And I always considered Glendale my hometown, because that's where I grew up. That's all the experiences that I had. And in fact, most of my life was in Glendale until I moved to Florida. But being in Glendale, you get some Disney experiences. My third grade teacher was Mrs. Disney. She was the second wife of Herbert, the mailman, who is Walt's brother. And I just remember her being really, really old. But as soon as I discovered that her name was Disney, I immediately took a big sheet of easel paper, so it was a huge sheet of paper, and I drew Jiminy Cricket, because at the time Jiminy Cricket was perhaps my favorite Disney character. And so I drew Jiminy Cricket, and I gave it to her in the hopes that she would immediately take it to the Disney studios, where they would immediately hire me, and I wouldn't have to learn my multiplication tables. I guess Portfolio Review at Disney was backed up for decades, because it took me until 1995 to be hired by Disney. But she was very nice. She was also the person who told me that I shouldn't sing. As we were practicing for the Christmas holiday show, you trot out all these little elementary school students, wearing their reindeer antlers and a green sweater or a red sweater, whatever. And so we were practicing, and as we were practicing, she looked over at me and she said, Jimmy, are you singing? And I just, puffed out my chest and proudly said, yes, I am. And she goes, you shouldn't. And so for the Christmas presentation, I was up there with my friends, and I just mouthed the words.
Stick to art, kid. There is something I want to touch on, because you did something incredibly bold and daring, probably something that could never happen today because you were frustrated about things that were going on in your home life and in your professional career in the fourth grade. Tell us what you did that I think was just brilliant, how you came to know and befriend and visit at their home many of those Disney animators whose work you admired as a kid.
And yes, this is when I had become a teenager, and a lot of this too was thanks to the fact that I had a very loving and supportive mother and father. So okay, what's going to make you happy, and we'll support you, and all of this. Well, when I was about 13, 14. I started really, and remember in those days, there weren't the great number of books that we have now, where and some of them are magnificent, that have all of the information and all of the names. And when I was 13, 14 years old, this was all still that mystery. You take that magic pencil and animation just comes. And I was always interested in art, always interested in animation, always interested in Disney, because Disney seemed to have that better quality than what I was seeing elsewhere. And so, as I was watching the Disney cartoons, or as I was watching the weekly Disney television series where they would run animated cartoons, I would take a look at the end credits, and this is in the days before VCR, so you can't tape and slow it and whatever. So I would scribble down the names of the people listed at the end, and I had no clue what the difference was between a animator and an assistant animator and a cleanup person and special effects or whatever. All I did was I would write down these names, and then, as I said, Glendale is right next to Burbank, where the Disney studios are. And so there was a Glendale Burbank phone book. So they had phone numbers for both the Glendale area and the Burbank area. And a lot of the employees who worked at Disney lived in Glendale. And so I started flipping through the phone book, trying to match up names with the names I had written down, and I phoned up. And how do you make them move? And I would say about 90% of them were very gracious. The 10% that weren't thought that it was a gag, that one of their friends had set this up, for this. But many of them invited me to come over to their house to talk with them and listen to stories and to ask questions, all that. The very first one that I interviewed, and I love him dearly to this day. He's passed away. Jack Hanna. Jack Hanna started at the Disney Studios as an animator and worked his way up into being a story man. He was a story team with Carl Barks, and then later went on to being a director of many of the classic Donald Duck cartoons and Chip and Dale cartoons, as well as directing some of the Disney television shows. And by the time I got to him, he had left the Disney studio, and he was working as an instructor at Cal Arts in their character animation department. So maybe that's why he was a little bit more forgiving. So anyway, he said, oh, yes. And so I wrote him this formal letter. I wish I still had it today, requesting an opportunity to come and ask him some questions, and being as adult as a 14-year-old possibly could. Fortunately, I wore glasses, so I was already more mature and an adult than most 14-year-olds. And so he responded and said, yes, why don't you come up Saturday at such and such a time. And I was completely scared because I didn't think he was going to say yes, and now that he does, what questions do I ask? I don't even know what questions to ask. And so I had Mom and Dad drop me off up there, and actually dropped me off a half hour early. And I was in my suit and tie, my best suit, and I'd polished the shoes, the whole bit, and tie, but I was there a half hour early, and I didn't want to be rude, and because he said 2 o'clock, I didn't want to show up at 1:30, that he's expecting me at 2 o'clock. So I walked around the block for a half hour before I finally walked up the steps. It was on a little hill, a little incline, so I had to walk up the steps, and I rang the bell, and Jack came, and he was a short guy and very stocky because he had been a fighter, and I said, Mr. Hanna, I'm Jim Korkus. I wrote to you, and he says, yeah, he says, we were wondering about that. My wife and I were looking out the window for the last hour, seeing you walk around the block over and over, and we were wondering, why doesn't he just come on? And I had with me a little cassette tape recorder, a very, very cheesy little thing. And so we sat down. His wife was very nice. We sat down in the living room, and, my mouth just hit the ground because it was filled with all of these things. He had a Duckster award, which looks almost like an Academy Award statuette. People who retired from the Disney studios or who had done something of great achievement usually got a Mousker, which was Mickey Mouse. And there's a handful of Ducksters out there, and of course, Jack got a Duckster because he was considered the Duck Man. He wrote stories. He had animated on Donald Duck cartoons. He had written stories for Donald Duck cartoons. He had directed Donald Duck cartoons. He had directed Donald Duck on the TV show. So he had that. He also had some paintings because he was a terrific landscape painter with several shows. But he had some Disney things, and I thought, oh my God, I just wanted to melt, but he was very gracious. His wife was very gracious, and so started off with the same type of questions that you do today on interviews. Where were you born? What was your training in art? How did you get hired at Disney and all of that? And we were supposed to talk for I think it was a half hour, 40 minutes, but we ended up being almost 2.5 hours, where his wife came in and said, well, are you staying for dinner? And it's like, no, I don't want to push that.
So as I said in the beginning, Jim, it's an interesting and a fun and circuitous route how you go from the kid who's told not to sing or to draw to calling up animators to writing and sort of accidentally becoming a historian on Disney animation. But then you go on, you get your master's degree, you are a theater performer and a director and a show developer and work in places like McDonald's and, not at McDonald's, but do shows for McDonald's and cruise lines and the LA Zoo. You're a magician, you were a teacher, you were an arts department chairman. You were on the Gong Show. So again, a whole nother story, even before you got to the company and how much you've done since you've been at Disney, from entertainment to animation to being an instructor to, again, the extension of the writing, not just for shows in the parks, at Disney Institute, the Disney Vacation Club, the Disney Cruise Line, 100 years. The list literally goes on and on and on and on. And you've written so much in literally hundreds upon hundreds of magazines like Disney Files and the DVC things. You've also contributed to books. The first ones that come to mind are Didier Guez's great Walt's People book, which has a number of interviews that you've done in it. Currently, you contribute to Celebrations magazine, which I think is amazing, and I say that as a fan, not as the publisher. But in all the years that I've known you, I know I was not the only person who's been telling you, Jim, you got to write a book. And so I think one of the questions I always had for you was, now that you have this book coming out, The Vault of Walt, can maybe tell us, what was it that either held you back from doing it earlier, or what was it that compelled you to write this book now?
Well, as you can tell from talking with me, all of this was done to impress women.
Right.
And obviously none of this other stuff impressed women. Did shows for Harvey's Casino in Lake Tahoe, for J.C. Penney's, for Montgomery Ward's, didn't impress women. Did a quarterly column for the Disney Vacation Club's Disney File magazine, went out and did presentations on their members' cruise, didn't impress women. So it was about time to try and find something else that was going to impress women. Actually, back in the late 80s, I wrote a couple of books with my writing partner and my business partner, John Cawley. We wrote the Encyclopedia of Cartoon Superstars, the How to Create Animation, the Buyer's Guide to Animation Art, Cartoon Confidential, all of those. But we wrote those as a team, and then we were going to spin off and write books separately. And in fact, the last book we wrote as a team came out in 1992. And then, as you know, 1995, I moved to Florida, and there really wasn't time to write a book because I was taking care of Mom and Dad. I was trying to get my foot in at Disney, trying to get all of this involved. And thank heavens I didn't write a book then, because in the 15 years I've been out here in Florida, I've learned so much more. I'm learning things every single day, but especially working at Disney, I got to hook up and connect with an awful lot of people who knew Walt, who had worked opening Disneyland, who had worked opening Walt Disney World, and so that opened up even more doors for me. So what I started to do was, if a book's going to come out, it needs to be different than the other Disney books that are out there, because there's some terrific Disney books out there. In fact, I think Lou Mangello has written a terrific Disney book or two. But it needs to be something that just doesn't tread over the same territory, but takes a look at something new, something different. And so I started writing columns for the on the internet. And in fact, I took the pseudonym Wade Sampson and would write every Wednesday on mouseplanet.com a column on Disney history. And one of the reasons for that was to get it out there and take a look at it as a rough draft. And so corrections could be made. Sometimes by writing that column, I would be contacted by people who were involved with that topic. I wrote about the Mickey Mouse Theater of the Air radio show, and I got contacted by the daughter of the person who was the musical director on the show. And so she was actually alive when that show was being done, so she shared some memories. She also shared her father's unpublished memoirs that he had written, so there was information about that. So there was all of this new information coming in, and I thought, it's time to get a book out there. And many people had said, oh, Jim, you need to write a book. And from past experience, I knew there really isn't any money involved in writing a book, unless you're a J.K. Rowling or a Stephen King. So you can't be writing the book for the money, because the money's just not going to be there. You need to write the book for another reason. You need to write the book because you've got to share these stories, because if you don't, they're going to be lost. Or you've got to share these stories because, by gosh, they're fun. Or you've got to share these stories because it's going to be like a Disney history companion. It's going to fill in some of the nooks and crannies and spots that are missing in some of the other Disney books.
So let's talk about what's in the book. I mean, it's called The Vault of Walt. It's not about Walt's cryogenically frozen body, but let's talk about...
Absolutely not. We're staying away from that. Wanted to come up with a title that was sort of catchy. I think the title, The Vault of Walt, just sort of is playful on the tongue there, and it gives an indication that it's going to relate to Disney. And basically, these are stories that have been locked away for years. And they've been forgotten because they've been locked away. And so now, for the first time, and on the front cover, you'll see there's even a vault dial. You're going to spin the dial and open up the vault and let these out. Dust them off, shake them out, and share them. And this is different than other Disney books because every chapter is self-contained. So you don't have to start at page 1 and then read all the way to page 463. You can pick and choose what you want to read, and it's all complete. And I divided the book into 4 sections. So there's about 10 chapters about Walt himself. So Walt's 30th wedding anniversary is a chapter. Walt's connection with Dee Malay is a chapter. Walt's connection and his thoughts about religion is a chapter. Then there's a section with about another 10 chapters that deal with Disney films, both animated films and live-action films, but the ones that people don't talk about, like Lieutenant Robin Crusoe or Aristocats. And so all of that information there. Then there's a third section that deals with the Disney theme parks. And so your listeners are very familiar with stories that I tell about the Disney theme parks. And if they've ever said, boy, I would love to have those in a book so that I could spin through and read, well, there's a section of 10 chapters just for you, including one on Cinderella's Golden Carousel, again with some more information. In fact, one of the questions you asked when we did the Merlin interview was, well, why did they pick Merlin? Why the Sword and the Stone? And I said, well, because they wanted to go back to classics and all that. And by golly, as soon as I got home, I realized it was because they moved the carousel at Disneyland, and then they put the Sword and the Stone there first. The carousel at Disneyland is King Arthur's Carousel. So if you're doing the sword, you want something there that also relates to King Arthur, so you got Sword and the Stone. So anyway, new stuff in that. And then the final chapter is miscellaneous stuff that really wouldn't fit comfortably into the other chapters. So you got another 10 chapters, and they deal with things like Khrushchev's non-visit to Disneyland, the Mickey Mouse Theater of the Air. There's a wonderful chapter that Diane Disney Miller likes, which covers Walt Disney's housekeeper, Thelma Howard, who they nickname Frou-Frou, and Walt's nurse, Hazel George. And again, Diane, especially on the Walt chapters, read through and gave her input and gave her approval. And so I am very thankful and grateful to her.
And she also did, which is something she's only done a couple of other times, is she actually wrote the foreword for the book as well. But the thing that I like is something that you mentioned, and the thing that I really enjoyed, I was able to get a copy of the book before the interview. I love the fact that each chapter is its own story. It's not something I'm like, all right, I need to sit down and read this book beginning to end because I'm going to become intrigued by page 5. No, I could have picked it up, and that's what I did. I sort of picked up and read individual stories. And I love the fact that it's not just about Walt the man, which is what that first section really brings to you, is it very much personalizes Walt, but certainly my interest in the theme parks and some of the other things that I was so unfamiliar with. And what makes your stories that you do in magazines, that you do here on the show, and certainly what makes this book unique is that in addition to the inordinate amount of research you do, and I know what a fact checker you are, the beauty really lies in that so many of these stories are so personal. And by that, I mean that you either experienced something yourself or you actually sat down and you spoke with a lot of the people who were relaying the information. So tell us a little bit about the research process, which admittedly you've been doing since you were a kid. And look, I've been to your house. I have seen what can only be described as the largest Disney and animation reference library anywhere, literally encompasses the entire home. Incredibly impressive. And just by the way, Jim, remember, if anything ever needs a good, loving home, I'm here for you.
I've got you on the list, Lou. I've got you on the list to come cherry pick because, again, I have some books that don't exist at the Disney archives even. I have some books and magazines that don't exist at the Disney Family Museum up in northern California. I think one of the things that I do is I try to go for primary research. So, for instance, on the chapter dealing with Three Little Pigs, other people have written about Three Little Pigs. I went and I took a look at newspaper and magazine articles from the year that it was released. And as a result, I got 3 great quotes from Walt that have never appeared anywhere else since that 1933 interview, and where he's talking about the Three Little Pigs. And in fact, in one, he goes, "We had no idea. We thought it was just going to be another regular silly symphony." He says, "I certainly had no clue that it was going to take off and be a hit." So, you try to do the primary. Right now I'm writing an article on the Rainbow Road to Oz, and there are 2 really fine articles out there about that project, but both of them mention that, well, in the one scene, the Scarecrow helps the Patchwork Girl put patches onto her dress. Well, I've just watched that scene multiple times, and that doesn't happen in the scene at all. And yet, when I take a look on the Internet and I look for other references to that, I see that they cut and pasted from those 2 articles, and so that is out there. But that scene does not exist. That's not. And I take a look at the script. That's not even in the script. So you have to go back and do the primary work. Also, the thing that you touched on is for over 30 years now, I've been interviewing Imagineers and animators and cast members at the Disney theme parks and associates of Walt, friends and family. And you have to be careful about that, because sometimes people will have an agenda, or sometimes people will only have their perspective on the story. So you have to go back and double-check, because, again, too, sometimes they're doing that unintentionally, so you don't want to embarrass them in print. Well, they said such and such. Well, that didn't happen at all. But you'll notice in the book, too, and I had this discussion with the publisher back and forth, and fortunately he finally agreed with me, is there's an awful lot of quotes in the book, because I feel that it's very important for the people who were there to tell the story. And especially in the chapters devoted to Walt, I tried as much as possible to pull from letters that he wrote and interviews that he had done and things that supposedly he had written, so that Walt could tell his story in his own words as much as possible, although oftentimes you're going to have to fill in those gaps. And the thing is oftentimes people say, "Well, Jim, you're just like Dave Smith," and it's like, no, I've known Dave Smith for 30 years. I love Dave Smith. I respect Dave Smith, but Dave Smith is an archivist, and an archivist is like a librarian. You gather, you gather that material, you record that material, you document that material so it can be used, and that's a very, very important job. I'm a historian. I'm a Disney historian. I take that material and I tell the story of that material. Stories are very important because they touch our sense of reason and our sense of emotion. And since the very beginning of time, we've used stories to structure information and transfer information. Oftentimes, and the reason we do that is because if you tell somebody a fact, it's just a fact, America began in 1776. Okay, fine. There's no emotional connection. There's no understanding of why 1776 is important. But if you tell the story, of what led up to that, of what was going on, of the people involved, suddenly that becomes alive, and suddenly you remember that. And so with the Vault of Walt, I wanted to open up the vault, pull out those stories that were in danger of being lost, and sharing it with other people so that tradition of sharing the stories could go on. And the stories are fun. They're not dryly academic. They're a lot of fun. And so I'm extremely excited about the book because it's great that these stories are out there. I'm also sad that I couldn't get more of the stories out there. This is a huge book. As you saw, you've got almost 40 separate chapters, and these are lengthy chapters, and there's still more to tell, still more to share.
And the thing that intrigued me about the book and what I enjoyed was, when I saw Vault of Walt, I expected to be primarily comprised of stories either about Walt Disney himself, his early days at the studio, but there's a lot more to that, in that there's older stories about Walt and things like the Three Little Pigs and Song of the South and the Aristocrats and Toby Tyler, but there's also a lot of contemporary things as well. There's the Fountain at Epcot.
There's the Mickey Mouse Review. There's the first complete story about the creation of Captain EO, from creation to premiere. Actually, it's the Vault of Walt because a lot of that is about the time period that Walt was involved with, but it also covers Walt's legacy.
Right.
Some of the things that developed that came from that same spirit of Walt. For instance, in the Mickey Mouse Review chapter, Bill Justice talks about the reason that he created this attraction was he felt there needed to be something at the parks to represent Walt's animation history, and he did not see that was in danger of being lost, that animation history, that animation music history, let's do something.
Yeah, and even some of the titles of the chapter were very intriguing to me. So when you read something like The FBI's Most Wanted, the Mickey Mouse Club, and don't give it away. Don't give it away. That was one of the ones that I ran to read first. Or The Alice in Wonderland That Never Was. Walt's Women, Two Forgotten Influences, certainly very intriguing. But as I was reading the book, Jim, it's a great read, not just because of the content, but as I was going through it, and this is why I love having you on the show, I could almost hear you telling them to me, the reader, as they were stories. Again, not just because of the content that's in there, but it's the way that you tell them here. I think even differently than in other things I've read from you, because that passion really comes through on the written word in the book.
Well, thank you so much, Lou. That's very flattering, and I'm happy that comes through. I do have a real love for this material. I have a great love for Walt Disney. I have a great love for the parks. And even today, people say, "Well, Jim, they laid you off. Do you hate Disney?" And I go, "No, I love the Disney brand. You can love Disney and still have concerns about how the Disney business is being run." And so, yes, throughout the book, there's no, well, look, this was so much better than what Disney is doing now. There's none of that. It's like, this was really good. Let's remember how good this was. Let's remember how fun this was. And if you've seen this in the park a million times, maybe that 1,000,001st time, you'll see it a little bit differently after you've read this chapter. You'll appreciate something a little bit more. The blood, sweat, and thought that went into creating that. Maybe this will, just as you brought back memories of my going to Disneyland with my folks, maybe this will bring back some memories for some readers of their time at Walt Disney World, or their time at Disneyland, or their time of seeing that particular Disney animated film or that Disney live action film, because every Disney film is somebody's favorite Disney film. And oftentimes, we just hear the same stories over and over and over about the same films. I love Snow White, but I would love to hear more stories about something. I would love to hear more stories about the Sword and the Stone. I would love to hear more stories about the Aristocats. I would love to hear, because nobody tells those stories.
Yeah, I noticed that there was no Home on the Range chapter in here, but other than that,
that's for the sequel. That's
right.
for the sequel.
But I mean,
actually, for the sequel, I was out here. I was out here when they were working on Mulan and Lilo and Stitch. So maybe there'll be some stories involved with that, and some stories of some other animation projects that Flora Animation was working on. That, and what a shame that that studio is now closed. But I got to just touch lightly on that on my time out here. That'll be in the sequel. And again, remind your readers, if you want a sequel, you have to vote with your pocketbook. You have to vote with your wallet. And you vote by buying that book, you know.
I was going to say, I know that this is not the exhaustion of the Jim Corkis mental and physical library. And I felt that the book not only left me wanting more, but I felt that it really served as not just a great read, but it brought an introduction to a lot of things that certainly people have never heard before, but it serves to help them appreciate and to preserve that magic more. But I have to think that along the way, as you were researching it, especially because you are a fan first, you are that little kid who was a fan first, there had to be still
a huge fan, yeah.
Right. So there had to be almost another layer of stories about some of what you discovered. You know, did you find, and I'm sure there are many, but along the way, as you were putting the book together or putting the stories together, anything particular that you found that was of either particular interest or was surprising to you or even humorous to you during the research process?
Oh, countless stories.
Other than the fact that it's not going to get you checks.
I think one that sticks out, of course, was how deeply religious Walt Disney was, because again, that really isn't covered anywhere else. And in fact, Diane Disney Miller read that chapter, and she said, "I had no idea that that's how my dad felt, and that's how my dad, because he really didn't talk about that with us. He did these things. You could see by his actions, this is what he believed in, but you found him talking about this." And so Walt never, once he came to California, he did not go to church on Sundays. That was it. But he was deeply religious. He read the Bible, and he was very, very adamant that every religion be respected. And I think that was so important because there's that urban myth that Walt was an anti-Semite, that he had a vendetta against Jewish people, and you read what he's saying, and it's like, that's not even close to this man. Right. This man, had all of these Jewish friends. He supported all of these Jewish religious activities and events and all of these other things, and you go, holy cow! Who is this man that he's doing this? And again. You talked about the Alice in Wonderland chapter. One of the huge surprises to me was we've always read that when Huxley, the author of Brave New World, wrote a possible screenplay for Alice in Wonderland, that it was rejected because it was too literary. And, I always accepted that too. It was like, oh, yes, well, outside authors, they really don't understand how animation works. Animation is more of a visual medium than a literary medium, and so you have to express it visually, not through the play of words and all this. Ran across the 14-page treatment that he wrote for Alice and the Mysterious Mr. Carroll. So that the thing he wrote was not an animated film; it was going to be like Song of the South, where there was going to be a live-action Lewis Carroll and a live-action Alice. And there would be animated segments that certain things in the story would prompt an animated trip to Wonderland, which would then influence the live-action story. And here is something I don't think anybody ever found, and I found when I was doing this because, okay, well, now I've found the treatment. Okay, let's see what Walt's comments are on this. And Walt likes this, but sees that there needs to be some work. And I'm taking a look at the last meeting that they had on Huxley's story, And it's taking place at the Disney Studios, and I'm taking a look at the date, and it's December 7th, when Pearl Harbor happened. That morning, Walt Disney and a couple of his folks, like Bill Cottrell and all, and Huxley, they were at the Disney Studio talking about the Alice in Wonderland project, and then went home, and Pearl Harbor happened. Holy cow!
Again, it's the stories that you're not going to hear anywhere else. And it's funny that you mentioned specifically religion, because one of the chapters in the book I enjoyed was the Gospel According to Walt, because of his fascination with religion, but how he so delicately avoided in his films any sort of mention of or dealing with specific religions, and how he adjusted sequences and things like Fantasia, and even how there was at one point the idea of having a church on Main Street in Disneyland, and then I tried to think of what that would have been like. And again, you speak to Diane Disney Miller, who says that her father didn't want any particular denomination represented, so he chooses not to have one, even though it had such great meaning to him. So that to me was some of the things that I found that were threaded throughout the book, were some of those little stories and little anecdotal bits like that.
Well, and you see in that chapter that the opening day of Disneyland, he had representatives from the Catholic Church and the Jewish Church and Protestant, but I also list all of the people and all of the churches that he personally invited to attend the opening day of Disneyland. And they're all over the map. They're Mormon churches, they're all sorts. He wanted Disneyland to embrace everyone, and that's how he wanted the films as well. And in fact, at one point, Diane was thinking about becoming a nun, and apparently that was okay with Walt. And at another point, Sharon, his other daughter, was dating a Jewish young man, and Walt and Lillian had no problem with that whatsoever, supported it completely. And it's like, holy cow. And again, a lot of times religion is very difficult to talk about, and or uncomfortable to talk about for some people, and Walt just didn't talk about it. But I dug through and found places where he did, and have included those in there. So again, it's my hope that future researchers will now have this material to pull from. So instead of cut and pasting from, other books or magazine articles, whatever, that might be misleading or people made a wrong assumption, here are the facts. Here is the truth, and here is the quote, and here are the dates, and here are this. You can use this as a reference so that the true story, the real story, will get out there.
And again, not just because the information is verifiable, and again, I spoke to your research, but because I love the fact that it so personalizes Walt Disney the man. We spoke at length about when we were talking about One Man's Dream, how for many young people, Walt Disney is a company, it's Mickey Mouse. To know about his feelings about things like that really brings another level of depth to our understanding and our appreciation of Walt, and how that sort of transcends things even today. So as you're going through it and doing all the research, was there any sort of one challenge or number of challenges that you faced, again, especially since you're trying to talk about things that happened decades ago and maybe were not documented well early on?
Well, yeah. My gosh, these things are so old, they're even before I was born. So
nothing's
it's a
that
challenge.
old.
And again, the frustrating thing is a lot of the people who were involved, yes, they're no longer there where you can ask them, and they never talked about it anywhere else. I told you I'm writing an article right now about the Rainbow Road to Oz, and that's the frustration. And then the frustration too is trying to confirm these things. You'll hear a great story, but it's like, is that a great story or is that a great true story? How do I If I can't reasonably, prove that, I can't include that, because I can't just say, well, that's I think that probably did happen. Well, no, did it or not? Let's get that out. So very frustrating. Also very frustrating rewriting, because as I mentioned to you, I'm a good enough artist to know how really bad I am. Other people go and go, oh my gosh, I wish I could draw like that, and oh, you can do that, and it's like, yes, thank you very much, and I'm very flattered. But boy, I can see there's the mistake there, and no matter how much I practice, I'll never get better over here. The same thing with my writing is, I'm never satisfied with my writing. Is there a better way of saying this? Could I move this here? Should I eliminate that there? And again, that was one of the real heartaches too, is that as much as I included in the book, in each of those chapters, there are sections I just had to leave out because there just wasn't enough space. I know you run into that same frustration too, especially on your CDs, and you've got those two great ones that you just released, Liberty Square and Toontown Fair. But I know especially on Liberty Square, you probably had about 3 times as much information and wonderful things than you could have included within that hour and a half that you have there.
Well, and to that point, you think, okay, something like Liberty Square, it's the smallest land. It's, there's not a lot to fill in there. But I'm sure as you're looking at some of these quote unquote simple stories, yeah, there's not that much there. But the deeper that you dig, you find how many layers there really is. And Liberty Square and some of the stories you tell are perfect examples, how you can make a full chapter out of some of the relatively simple topics as you look at things like the Epcot Fountain or the Golden Oak Ranch or, Tinker, all those things. You peel back so many layers of the onion. So I'm going to ask you a question.
Speaking of Tinkerbell, isn't that fascinating? I think this may be the first book that mentions that. Nobody ever asked that question. We all accept Disney history. We don't ask that question. Nobody ever asked. Most people know the first Tinkerbell in 1961 who flew over Fantasyland was Tiny Klein from the Ringling Brothers Circus, and she was a grandmother, and she was in her 70s, right. All right? And we accept that. Not one person, and this includes me, not one person ever asked, why would Walt hire a 70-year-old grandmother to do this? Well, okay, she had experience in the Ringling Brothers Circus doing the slides. Why would she? One of the things you'll see in my chapter is in 1958 at the Hollywood Bowl, there was a special event. There was a special show saluting the music of Disney, and Walt was there. And one of the things they did in the show in 1958 is Tiny Klein, dressed as Tinkerbell, went down the wire from the top of the Hollywood Bowl down to the stage. And so, of course, 2 years later, Walt is going to say, I love the woman who did that. Get me that woman. Yeah. I don't care if she's a grandmother. I don't care if she's 70 years old. Get her. But yes, you see, that's one of those little things, doesn't appear elsewhere, but once you get it, it helps connect the dots so that you can tell that story.
And I pulled up that chapter and I said, oh, I know the Tinkerbell story. I've met Margaret Carey. I know but from the second paragraph, and again, I'm not going to give it away, when you talk about what Tinkerbell's name almost was, and then you're reading things and quotes from Dave Smith, and you're reading quotes from Margaret Carey, and you're talking about things that Mark Davis and his work on it. It was just fascinating, and again, I was having more of those Jim Korkis aha moments.
And we've got more of those coming for the podcasts too. You mentioned One Man's Dream. I found out in researching for this book, and I wasn't able to include it in this book. I found out more information about Granny Kincaid's Cabin and Project Little Man, where we can do 45 minutes just on those. So when that attraction opens up again in November, if both of those are still in there, we've got to go in there and talk about that, because I've got things that nobody else knows, and they're not even in the book.
Right, and who knows what else they've brought in there. So, yeah, there is definitely going to be a One Man's Dream Part 2. So I started saying before, there was a question that I was hesitant to ask you, but I know it's one that I think a listener would probably want to ask you, especially after reading this book, or maybe they've asked you in the past. So I'm sure look, you've been able to speak to so many legendary figures in the Disney company, from animators to executives to actors and actresses, whatever it might be. But certainly, you never had the opportunity to speak with Walt as much as you know, and I don't think there's anybody that knows as much about Walt as you do. So imagine, Jim, that you have but one question to ask Walt, other than, can I have a job and Ironclad lifetime
why
contract?
Why did you lay me off, Walt?
Right, which I think you deserve. You deserve the job and the Ironclad lifetime contract. But have you ever thought about that? It's okay, you've got your one question to ask Walt Disney. What would it have been?
Wow, that's an incredible question to ask, and I've never even considered that before, because there's so much, because he's done so much. I would probably try to ask one of those open-ended questions, because with Walt, once you got him started, he'd just keep talking. So I would probably just look at him and I'd go, why? And then just let him interpret from that, and go off. Why the whole thing? Why Disneyland? Why? And because
if he would have said, if he would say to get chicks, it would be the perfect answer.
To impress women, yes, to impress women. No, because people asked him. In fact, in my book, I use that quote from him. Walt was asked, how would you like to be remembered? And he says, I'm a storyteller. Of all the things I've done, I'd just like to be remembered as a storyteller. People ask him, what's the proudest thing, about the company? And he says, well, just building the thing. He was even asked in the Canadian Broadcasting interview, how would you do things differently if you had to do it over again? And he says, well, I hope I wouldn't have to do it all over again. He says, but I wouldn't change anything. I enjoyed every minute of it. And that includes all of the speed bumps. That includes falling in the halls. And I was just looking at an unpublished interview with Walt yesterday, where the interviewer says, well, everybody thinks you're infallible. And Walt goes, oh, no. He says, I fall in the holes. He says, but I'm smart enough now that I know how to avoid some of those, and I don't fall in as deeply as I used to. He says, but I have more successes than I have failures, and that's what people remember.
Well, it's funny and appropriate, I guess, that you mentioned that quote about Walt being a storyteller, because in my notes in preparation for the interview, I had pulled that quote as well, because he did say, I'm a storyteller, and he wants to be remembered as a storyteller. And I think, from this book and your appearances on the show and your contributions to the magazine, I'm so proud to have you share this with me and my readers and listeners. But I think you should be proud knowing that the way you are a storyteller, and by sharing these stories with us, you, Jim, are following very much in Walt's footsteps.
Lou, that is so kind of you, and I'd love to be remembered as a storyteller, and other people have commented on that, especially when I do presentations, that it's not just the information. They love hearing the story, that I make the story come alive for them, which I've definitely tried to do in that book. So I'm very flattered by that. Thank you. So I will accept being a storyteller, even if it doesn't impress women. I'm happy to be a storyteller.
Well, I'm going to get you a T-shirt made up, and it's going to have all of your credits on the front, and in the back, it's just going to say "impressed."
Well, it's a good thing I'm a large guy, which is going to need a double XL shirt, so that there'll be room for all of these, because we still didn't even cover some of the things that I've done. And so I've had I've had a very blessed life. I've had a very amazing life. I've had an awful lot of opportunities, and I've tried to do my best to help others along the way. And I hope that even by sharing these stories on your podcast have helped some of your listeners. Some of your listeners either enjoy the park more or become big man on campus when they share those stories with their friends and family, and along that. And Lou, you are very much in the same league. I think people love listening to you. They love listening to your stories. That the whole 24-hour podcast that you did, I think the comments that you got were people who just loved you talking, whether it was about ice cream or whether it was about Disney. It was all good because it was a Lou Mongello story. And people love your CDs, which they should go buy if they don't have all of those, and the 2 new ones that are out there, and the books as well. And then Celebrations magazine, for crying out loud, one of the hidden treasures of Disney, with wonderful stories and wonderful writers and columnists in there. So thank you, Lou, for keeping the stories alive.
Listen,
and that is so important.
And see, that just goes to show the kind of person that you are, because here we are trying to talk about Vault of Walt, and you're mentioning the things that I do, and you're very much an inspiration in that, and I appreciate that. But you are the person that is continuing to carry on Walt's legacy and to spread the magic. And the Vault of Walt, the unofficial, unauthorized, uncensored, but family-friendly Disney Stories Never Told by Jim Korkis, is now available. I'm going to put a link right on the website in this week's show notes where you can go out and purchase the book. I highly, highly recommend it. It very quickly became, not just because you're here, really one of the most favorite books in my Disney library, and I cannot recommend
again,
highly
let's
enough.
Remind your readers, even though it says unauthorized and unofficial and uncensored, that doesn't mean there are scandals in the book. There are no rumors. There are no psychological assumptions on all of that. Basically, these are stories that are untold and uncensored because they just didn't fit into other Disney books. So think of this as like a Disney History Companion, or they were stories that people just didn't know. So they didn't know to include them, or they didn't know where to go find the information for them. So this is very much a G-rated book, and I will tell you that if a interviewee used profanity, I cut that out of the quote. So this is very G-rated because again, the purpose was not to make people uncomfortable, was not to shock people. It's to surprise people. Oh, gee, I didn't know that, but didn't want to shock people, didn't want to offend people. Just want those stories out there. And thank you so much for promoting this, Lou. Maybe we can do some event together at Walt Disney World where we'll do a meet. People can come and they can talk about the book, because by that time they will have bought the book and they would have read the book and fallen in love with the book. So and
in love with Jim Korkis. Really, how can you not? How can you not? So again, Jim, thank you for your time. Thank you for all that you do to, again, share these amazing stories like no one else can. Again, the book is The Vault of Walt by Jim Korkis. I'm going to put a link directly to where you can purchase the book right in this week's show notes at WDWradio.com. And Jim, of course, you know you always have a home here at WDW Radio. I can't wait to have you back on again soon.
I'll look forward to it. Thank you, Lou, and thank you to all the listeners for lasting this long listening to all of this.
That's all the time we have for this week's show. Thanks again to my guest and friend, Jim Korkis. As you know, Jim has appeared on the show many, many times. If you go to WDWradio.com, click on the podcast link, or do a search for Korkis, you can find some of the other episodes on which he was a guest. I'll also put a link in this week's show notes to where you can purchase The Vault of Walt directly from Amazon.com. I'm also going to include a separate audio file that you can listen to right from this week's show notes. My interview with Jim was actually much longer, and we spoke a lot about his early history and background, some of his other jobs, and what led him to become the historian and come to work for Disney. So if you want to find out more about Jim, I'm going to put the complete unedited file in this week's show notes. You can go right to WDWRadio.com, click on podcast, click on this week's show, and you'll find the file right there. You can play it right from your browser. While you're there, be sure and check out our forums, blog posts. You can shop in the store. You can get signed copies of my Walt Disney World trivia books and my audio guide to Walt Disney World CDs. You can also download the free WDW Radio iPhone app and find out all the ways you can connect with me and the show through social networking channels like Twitter and Facebook and FriendFeed and so much more. You'll also find the entire archive of video segments. Look for a couple of new videos coming out in the next week or so as well. Quick reminder about some upcoming events. Don't forget the Swan and Dolphin first annual Food and Wine Classic is going to be next weekend, October 8th and 9th, starting at 4:30. There's going to be educational seminars, food samples, and lots more from some of the restaurants like Blue Zoo, Shula's, Il Molino, Komodo's, entertainment, lots more. I'm going to put a link right in this week's show notes where you can find out more. You can also purchase tickets for the full day or for a la carte samples right on the causeway. You can also get a direct link to the Swan and Dolphin Food and Wine Classic page directly from DisneyMeats.com. There I'll also post about future events, including the November and December meets of the month. As you can also get a link to the WDW Radio Cruise over at WDWRadioCruise.com. As you know, we're cruising on the Disney Dream, February 27th. There's new availability for inside and some additional cabins. For a no-obligation quote, come by WDWRadioCruise.com. And if you are coming, you can also find a link where you can purchase logo gear from CafePress.com. And you know I want the show to be interactive, so if you have a question you want me to answer, you can email me at lou@WDWRadio.com. If you want a chance to play Listener Fact or Fiction, one of them's coming up soon, you can email me at factorfiction@WDWRadio.com. Be sure to include your phone number. I may call you randomly to answer 10 true or false trivia questions about Walt Disney World for a chance to win a prize pack. Or if you want to be heard on the air with a comment, a question, or thought, you can call in at 888-703-2171. Don't forget to come by celebrationspress.com to order back issues, subscribe to, or find out how you can contribute to Celebrations magazine. We are working on issue 14 now, but we have a lot of back issues still available. Again, you can come by and visit over at celebrationspress.com. Thanks as always to my partners and sponsors, including MEI and Mousefan Travel. They are my official and recommended travel provider for all your vacation planning needs. And All-Star Vacation Homes has more than 150 homes within 5 miles of Walt Disney World. You can find out more by visiting their website by clicking on the link on the homepage of WDWRadio.com or by going to allstarvacationhomes.com. Stay tuned for another WDW Radio Live video broadcast and chat coming very soon. Again, best way to stay updated is through Twitter and Facebook. I'm twitter.com/Lou Mongello, facebook.com/WDW Radio. Again, I'll update you as far as upcoming WDW Radio Live video broadcasts, as well as some other projects and some things I'm working on that I'm getting ready to announce very soon. I'm also working on some new guests and some segments for the show that I think you're going to enjoy. If you have a suggestion of something you'd like to hear, or maybe something you'd like to contribute to the show or the blog, again, be sure and email me at lou@WDWRadio.com. And as always, my friends, if you like the show, all I ask is that you please help spread the word. Let others know about it. Tweet out that you're listening to the show or share the link over on Facebook. And if you can, please come by, review the show and or the app over in iTunes. And of course, my friends, most importantly, I hope that you become inspired to pursue your passion and always keep moving forward. And most of all, I hope that you have a great week. Thank you again for listening. See ya.
Hi, Lou. This is Shelley from Maryland. I just wanted to call in and say that I'm celebrating my 30th birthday today in Walt Disney World, my favorite place on earth. And we're sitting here at Epcot waiting to watch the British Invasion, which is our favorite show here. I just wanted to say I really like the show. I'm a huge fan, and I hope to see you sometime at a meet. And I'll see you real soon. Bye.
Hey, Lou, it's Darlene from Buffalo, New York. We're really looking forward to our Disney cruise in 5 months. And with it being the WDW radio show, and today's day in the calendar from Disney says Fun and Fancy Free was released on September 27th. Well, guess who's in it? Donald Duck. and Mickey Mouse and Goofy, and Donald Duck is the Aqueduct. So we're going to have a blast. Talk to you soon. Bye. Have a magical day.
Hi, Lou. This is Kathy Ring from Minneapolis calling again. My husband and I are at the airport ending our amazing honeymoon to Walt Disney World, and on our first cruise on the Disney Wonder, it was amazing. We got so many congratulations for being newlyweds. We got free ice cream and special desserts and the front of rides. It was amazing. We both had such a great time, and then we boarded the Disney Wonder on Thursday, and it was just the most amazing experience. The food, the crew was wonderful, and we're so sad to be leaving, but I already have my husband thinking about doing an anniversary cruise next year, so that's always a start. But thank you so much again for everything that you do, Lou, and giving us so many great tips and advice to make this trip so magical. Sorry we missed you. Hopefully we'll catch you again on our next trip. Thanks, Lou. Bye. Hi, Lou. This is the new Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Ring calling from Epcot. My new husband and I just enjoyed a delicious dinner at the new Hacienda San Angel. It was delicious. We had the La Hacienda, which had chicken, flank steak, chorizo, vegetables, this amazing chicken and cheese. Or, I'm sorry, not chicken and cheese, corn and cheese. It was so good. We just can't speak highly enough of our waiter, Sergio, who just took great care of us. So I highly recommend it to anybody who's coming to Epcot. It's really good, and the service is excellent. The view is beautiful as well. So we're having an amazing honeymoon. We've been here since Saturday, and we're just having the best time. On Thursday, we're going to board the Disney Wonder and go on a 3-day cruise, and we're really looking forward to that. But we just wanted to call in and recommend Hacienda to everyone and let you know that we're having a great time. Thanks, Lou. Bye.
Hi, Lou. This is Shelley from Maryland again. I was just calling to let you know that after I left my first message, I got engaged that night at the Magic Kingdom during the Halloween party on Peter Pan's flight, and I'm very, very happy and very excited, and I just wanted to share my good news with you. Thanks. Love the show. Bye.